Good morning, everybody, and welcome to DevReach. Let's kick things off today with Resumable JavaScript from scratch with Jeff Whelpley.
Thanks. How's it going, everyone? My name is Jeff Whelpley, as was said. I am a Google developer expert specializing in web performance and Angular. And I was also the co-creator of Angular Universal, which is the server rendering library for Angular. And also, I am the CTO and co-founder of GetHuman. And like many of you in this room, at work, I work for GetHuman, whatever company you work for, I'm sure that you love to delight your users. I get pumped when my users are excited, the people who use the things that I build, right? And there's a lot that goes into building a really great user experience. There's a lot of different ways that you can measure and go about figuring out a good user experience. But the type of stuff that I'm going to talk about in this talk today has to do with the initial part of the user experience, or even more specifically, performance related to that initial user experience. And we all know that when a site, your app, does not load quickly, it's a poor user experience, right? Like, users do not like that. I don't have to talk about that at length. That's something that's pretty well known, both you as developers and I'm sure you as users of other sites. And Google recognizes this too. So if you have a publicly facing website or app, you probably know as well that Google does reward the sites that are fast. They give you higher search rankings. So if you want to have your site at the top of the search ranking, it has to be fast. It has to have a great initial load performance. So it helps both for your users to have a great experience, and as a downstream effect of that, you then have better search ranking, and which leads to more users, and it helps on and on. So when we look at trying to measure initial load performance, which is, again, what we're talking about in this talk today, you can use Lighthouse. There's dev tools within Chrome. In all the different browsers, there's different dev tools you can use to run audits on your site. And when you're looking at this type of thing, there's a lot of different numbers, but after doing this a long time, there's really three key numbers that I always focus on. It's these three: the largest contentful paint, timed interactive, and cumulative layout shift. Where when you have under a second for largest contentful paint, which is the moment when the user sees a majority of your page, it has the feeling that your site, your app, is instantly loaded. When your cumulative layout shift, that number is 0, which is really what the target is, it means that stuff isn't jumping all around the page as it's being loaded. When it starts moving all around the page as it's loaded, that is a very poor user experience. It like jars in users' memory, and they hate it. And if they're coming from Google search to your site and they see a lot of that jank, a lot of times they'll click the back button and be gone, right? And then for timed interactive, that's for the amount of time it takes when the user sees the site and is able to actually click and type and start using the actual site for it being actually interactive. And I'm sure that, again, a lot of you have experienced from the user side of things, going to a site, trying to use a drop-down or something like that, and it's just not working. It's like delayed, or it just does, you click on a button, it doesn't do anything. And that's like very, very frustrating. So that's what we're trying to avoid. So to have a great initial user experience, we have to do well in all three of these areas. So for largest contentful paint, this is one of those things that is, the solution for this is a little bit more established, and it's pretty straightforward, even if it does require a little bit of work. And the best possible way, or the way to get the largest contentful paint, is if you're dealing with static HTML. Now, of course, we're all usually working on more sophisticated apps that might be JavaScript-based or something else on the back end, .NET, whatever else. So it's not as simple as this. But if you did have static HTML served up from a CDN, I mean, that's going to load really fast, right? So that's like the sort of the high water mark of like the best you can do. If we're talking about something like Angular, like we're building our app in Angular though, you can actually get it from that dynamic, the code that you're writing to this static HTML in two different ways. So I use the thing that I originally built, Angular Universal, for Angular, but there's equivalent for React has server rendering as well, where on the server you're generating HTML, and it's either at build time using SSG, static site generator, where you just generate a whole bunch of HTML and then you can serve it up, or a cache manager like Cloudflare or Amazon CloudFront, where at runtime it'll use your server rendering library to generate HTML and then serve it up to users. Either way, the end user has static HTML. It's loaded fast. I mean, this is a very well-baked solution that's out there that everybody should be using to have a very good, the best possible largest contentful paint, which is a very important part of initial load performance. The second thing for cumulative layout shift, this is one thing for Angular in particular, it's a little bit of a challenge because Angular Universal, the server rendering library, generates a view, generates static HTML that a user sees in their browser. And the thing that's not quite as ideal in Angular today is that the client side of Angular generates a completely separate view. It's completely separate from the server view, and the client view just obliterates the server view. Sometimes it can cause like a flash of white, and a lot of times it will cause jank, things moving around the screen, and the cumulative layout shift number will definitely not be 0 in a lot of cases. There are ways to get around this. That's a whole other separate discussion. There's all sorts of hacks, things that I've built. If you're interested, check out Angular Preboot. There's a ton of things along those lines. But the point is that when you have this type of setup, it's hard to achieve this particular metric. And so React and a couple other frameworks do something to solve this by hydrating the client app on the server view. So they don't blow away the server view. Instead, the client app will just attach itself to the server view. And this works well. I mean, there's still ways that there can be jank depending on what your client app is doing, but it makes it much, much easier to achieve this particular metric. So hydration is the key here. Now, the thing that doesn't necessarily have as great of a scalable solution as those first two is timed interactive. Timed interactive, as I mentioned, is when you're actually clicking on something after the page loads. And the challenge here is that when you think about what's the different approaches that you can take when you're building a, let's say, JavaScript-based application, and the different ways that you can build your app, the sort of slowest thing in terms of timed interactive is when you have to package all of your code and deliver all of, especially when it's a very large app with high complexity, when you have to package all of that and deliver it to the client in order to make anything in your page interactive, that's always going to be slower because, I mean, it's going to be bigger and it's going to increase as the complexity of your app increases. When you have more team members, more pages, more features, it keeps on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that timed interactive just gets larger and larger and larger. The fastest is if there's just one small function for the specific thing that needs to be done for a specific event. So when you're clicking on this button, I mean, what actually is happening when you click on that button? What is the minimal amount of code needed to just do that one action, right? Or let's think about it differently. Let's think about, we have a form here, right? And I know everybody loves coding forms. They're always very fun. But the typical mindset with this in terms of client-side JavaScript is that you are building for the entire form. So you have a ton of different interactions, and usually it's a lot of different JavaScripts. But theoretically, you don't necessarily need that. You could break it up into individual pieces so that, okay, you have an event handler for when the user's typing in that first text box for, like, let's say validation or something like that. And then you have another event handler for when the user clicks on that checkbox, and a different one for when they click on the button. So you could theoretically break it up so that each of those individual pieces just are separated and do their own thing, in which case they're much smaller. And when you do that, and if you were to measure the download amount of time per download of such a small package, it's always going to be extremely small. Usually under 40 milliseconds. This is using CDN perf for measuring performance of downloading something along this size. So it's always going to be fast. And the key part, and so this is the sort of key part about why what I'm talking about today matters, really. Our target TTI, and this is based off of a lot of research that's out there, is, user expectation these days has, maybe in the beginning days of the web, people were more tolerant to wait for 5-6 seconds for your page to load and be interactive. But these days, they want it to be instantaneous, right? So under a second, 900 milliseconds, target TTI. That is an aggressive one. That's not, having it under there is the best of the best for sites out there. So that's what we're trying to achieve. That's what we're talking about. We're trying to be the best, right? So you have to be around under a second. And of that 900 milliseconds, we still need some time for the server to render its view, and that's not a best case, but a good case for server view to get rendered and sent down to your client. 500 milliseconds is difficult, but it's definitely achievable, especially if you're using a CDN, you're using a cache manager, that type of thing. You can definitely get 500 milliseconds. So we're talking about 400 milliseconds for roughly, this is all estimates. It's all variable or whatever else, but this is all just to give you guys an idea. So let's just say, for the sake of discussion, about 400 milliseconds to do all of the work of downloading all the JavaScript you need, running it, bootstrapping it, and getting it ready to be interactive on your page. Now, maybe you could do this with like Preact, with a hello world type of thing, something where it's very, very small framework, very minimal like user code. But the thing is, as I mentioned a little bit before, your app grows in size. Regardless of, even if the framework that you're using is super small and does its best job, you're gonna, at your company, hire 5 or 6 contractors that are gonna write all sorts of terrible code, or maybe some good code and some terrible code. But regardless, it's gonna get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so this 400 milliseconds just becomes more and more impossible as time goes on. And that's the key. How can we get out of this cycle and instead do something where, regardless of what the complexity is, it doesn't matter how big it is, we still have the same optimal performance metrics. That's what we're talking about. And that's where resumability comes in. That's what the solution that I'm talking about, this idea of resumability, where we have a server view, we have the thing that's generated on the server side, and there's no full client app. Instead of this concept which a lot of us have kind of baked in our mind for JavaScript today of building this huge app that gets bootstrapped all at once, we instead just load it in pieces. And those pieces just take over from what the server, they resume what was happening on the server that paused, and then keep it going. And another way to think about this is Angular, React, all the different frameworks, they more do replay. They will basically rerun the same exact logic that happened on the server on the client, and then it gets up to speed. Whereas with resuming, you're pausing on the server, and then you're kind of restarting it just in that one small piece of whatever is needed for the specific user interaction that occurred. And so there is a framework that is built around this concept called Qwik. That's where I started learning about this. Misko, who was the creator of Angular, created this and started looking into it. But there's actually other frameworks. So Qwik doesn't own resumability. They obviously have kind of built their framework around it. But there's other libraries out there that do it. There's an internal one at Google. There's other people that have done it as well. But it's a good one to be able to learn more about this concept and to see it as a first-class citizen. But for us learning today, as the name of the talk suggests, I don't want to use any frameworks. I want to show you guys the concept of resumability, or at least some parts of the concept of resumability, just with raw JavaScript. No third-party libraries, basic JavaScript. So that is what we are going to do today. As I mentioned someone before the talk, I am terrible at live coding, so I've just done some screenshots of code and that I'll walk you guys through. And so it's going to be a to-do list. Love to-do lists. I live my life on to-do lists. And on the left side, you can see that it is just some static HTML that you can imagine was generated by a server rendered library of some sort. And there is right here the actual to-do list itself. It could have come from, let's say, a database that was generated on the server side, but now it is there in the HTML. And what we want our resumable JavaScript to do is to make these specific parts of the document interactive, right? We want it, when they click on the X, we want it to remove it, the item. When we want them, they click on the button add, we want it to add a new item. Simple, right? Okay. So in order to enable this, there is a bit of inline JavaScript that has to occur in the server view that sort of enables everything. So this is the sort of foundational stuff that allows for all of those event handlers to be downloaded and run. And so I'm going to walk through this for a second. And so we have a set of event handlers that we just, and by the way, this is, I would never suggest that you actually use any of this in a real production app. This is purely for demonstration purposes of the concept, okay? So you could definitely point out all sorts of edge cases where this is going to break. But I think it'll do a good job of showing you guys what I'm talking about. So I'm adding a bunch of event handlers on the window, and when once the DOM is loaded, I basically start to add my event listeners. So this is where I can take any sort of events. For this particular case, I'm listening for click events, mouse overs, mouse outs. And the key thing is that I'm adding the event listener at the entire document level. So if they, let's say for clicking, if they click anywhere in the document, it's going to capture this. And then I delegate it to a particular element. So let's get into the delegation part. So basically, when a user clicks like anywhere in the document, it will capture it. And we know the specific place they captured it because this is just part of how the raw JavaScript works. It will give you the target. And so we basically look that target and we go up the hierarchy to see, we look for something. So this is arbitrary. Like you could decide any attribute or any way of picking out where we want to actually run our events. But for the purposes of this, I made it so that it's whenever you put this attribute on dash or on colon and then the name of the event. So I just picked that out of whatever, just to pick something. So it'll look for that and then continue to go up the hierarchy because a user might click, let's say, in one box that might have a handler, but then the parent of that might also have a click handler as well, and you want to be able to run the event handler on both of those areas. So it goes up the hierarchy tree. So let's go into handling the event. And in here, what we're doing is we're looking at the value of that attribute. So for onClick, for example, I have addItem.js. So that's basically the location of the resumable JavaScript that's going to run and actually handle that event. And so it doesn't exist there now because remember, we want it to be scalable. We want this to, the app could be, 10 megabytes big in total, but we want it to be able to break it down into like 1 million different small event handlers. So this will be just like the one small event handler for this one specific thing that it'll download, and it knows where to get it and then run it. So we will, if it's already in memory, we'll just run it. Otherwise, we download it and run it. So this is just basic way of adding a script asynchronously. And once we download it, because it's asynchronous, we just have to kind of wait for a little while until it adds itself to the event handlers. And so when we go back to the to-do list, let's add those hooks that I mentioned, the on colon click. So we add those to the X's and to the add button. And then let's get into the actual event handler code now. So let's look at remove item. So this one is super simple. And I tried to make it as simple as possible. Obviously, if you're trying to synchronize with a backend database, like here, you would maybe have also an API call to the backend to update the database. But I'm literally just removing it from the HTML. And then for adding, Similar thing, a little bit more code, but the short of this is that it's taking what's in the text box and then it's going to stick it in HTML of the actual to-do list, right? So you'll notice that the key thing with resumability as well is that you shouldn't have to query again the database to get the to-do list because it's in the server view. And that's one of the key concepts is that the data, the state, is in the actual view itself. You don't query it again, and you just work off of that, and then obviously changes you can synchronize afterwards. So let's see this in action. So I'm just removing one of the items from the list by clicking on it, and then I'm gonna type in a new thing to feed the dogs, and add it, and I'll add a new one for watching TV, and then remove one more because I finished my presentation, and that's it. But that's all well and good, and that's hopefully gives you guys a good idea for just like a simple raw JavaScript example of what we're talking about. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're all using Angular or React or some other framework. How can we actually, like in reality, use this stuff, right? And so I want to focus on Angular just because that's what I do most of my work on. But there's some similar concepts that I'll mention with React and some of the other frameworks as well. So let's talk about resumability options for Angular. So the first one that's most simpler that's available today is just that if you have your Angular app in one place, you just create at a page level just a page in Qwik or some other resumability framework, and you just link them together. I mean, this is pretty simple, but it is something that is useful to do. I do this a lot with GetHuman, where we will take just certain pages and build them in new technology. So in this case, we're talking about resumability in Qwik, but I've done this before in the past in many other technology that we're trying out, and just kind of do it as a one-off thing, and it just links through just normal navigation, and then you're back into your core app. And this is a good way to experiment critically because we're talking about user experience and search ranking. This is very helpful to measure on a one-off. Before you change everything in your app, you just do it like for one page, measure it, see what happens over like course of months or whatever with user behavior and whatever else you're measuring, and see if it helps, and then kind of go from there. So this is pretty basic, but like it's at least a simple option you use today. Something that's a little bit more long-term is actually getting Angular itself to have some of these resumable characteristics. And there's really a couple challenges to do this with the framework Angular that also some of the other frameworks also have. So one of them has to do with code splitting. So today, Angular uses its CLI, which uses Webpack to do code splitting. And when it does this, yes, by default, it just packages all of your JavaScript together. Yes, you can split things up by route, but even that is going to be pretty large. You can split it up using standalone components for a single component, except it doesn't really package just a single component. And that's part of the issue, is that it will look at, let's say, this component that has two downstream dependencies, right? And Webpack will actually package all of that together, that component and its downstream dependencies. But the thing is, we don't actually need that for resumable JavaScript. We only need that specific component because the three components there are only needed for the initial render. When you render, you need those other components there. But for event handling, you just need the component itself. So you sort of need to have a different way of doing code splitting that is centered around this concept. And that's what Qwik does. There would have to be just a different way of doing it with Angular, or same thing if you want to do this with React, you would have to have a different way of doing it. Maybe someone can build a Webpack plugin that allows for this. Then the second thing is that when the server view that gets generated needs to add all those hooks for the actual event handlers. So I'm talking about this, where the on clicks with the name of the package and the name of the event, or however you want to do it, whatever arbitrary way that is decided is the best way to add those hooks. So you obviously need to add that. That is definitely something that just doesn't exist today that would need to be there. And then the last thing I'd mentioned, Angular has this current issue where the client view just sort of clobbers the server view, and you definitely would need to enable hydration within Angular. One thing here, as kind of a side note, so like when I helped Patrick Stapleton and I built Angular Universal during the original days of Angular 2, I was actually tasked with trying to build hydration into the original version of Angular Universal. So it was actually something that right from the start we were actually trying to do. And after months of working on it with one of the former core team members, Tobias, and just pulling my hair out, both Tobias and I realized that it was impossible with the current way that Angular was set up back then. It is better now, and the team has talked about certain ways of doing it, but resumable hydration is actually easier than even the stuff that for sure the stuff I was working on years ago, but even the stuff they've been talking about now, because I showed you how when an event is captured, you know the element, you know the target element, just because that's part of the event the event listening process. And so by definition, you know where to hydrate your individual component. So it simplifies one of the key challenges with hydration, which is how the client knows what to hydrate on. So when it's resumable, it actually makes that easier. So this is one of these things that doesn't exist today, but actually of the three challenges, that I think is the easiest. One third option that is, again, not here today, but is maybe a closer term, maybe, is the concept of a bridge between Qwik and Angular. So this is something that they've done with React, where you can author React components and then run Qwik as the actual the build. It builds the app in Qwik using other React components. And theoretically, you could do the same. So you wouldn't be using the Angular CLI to build. You would just write it in an Angular format. This is theoretical. This doesn't exist today, but an idea that's been floated around, that you would author it in Angular, and then but you would compile it with Qwik. So I don't necessarily think that's the best option per se, but I do think that if it's something that could be implemented in the short term, it would be good to be able to achieve those performance metrics, our objectives that we're trying to achieve for the short term, and potentially you would gain popularity for getting everybody to work on this option 2, these things that we need to change in order to enable this, which is really what I would love to have in the future. Okay, so to-do list for all of you for leaving this talk, okay? Number one, I do recommend you try out Qwik. Any new framework, the way I look at it is that you don't try these new technologies because you're gonna overnight convert everything you're doing to it. I look at it more so that you try out these new technologies because it gives you ideas that can help you with what you're doing right now and for the future. And this is one of those things where I think this does give you a lot of really good ideas. Some of the stuff I talked about in this talk, some I haven't, so I definitely recommend that first and foremost. Second thing is, as I mentioned before, is that you don't have to rebuild the whole app. I do think it's a really good idea if you do have a publicly facing website, a publicly facing app, to just try it out with one thing and measure it and just see if it does move the needle for you. It would be great to get feedback if you guys do try that, or if you have questions. I love to work with people doing this type of stuff. And then voice your support. So it's funny that there's differing opinions on whether the existing frameworks today, React, Angular, everything else, whether they're set up in a certain way today, and there's new ideas. Some people think, oh, that's not part of the framework. like that's totally different. It's never gonna, they're never gonna change or whatever. But then other people realize like, no, actually, that's the whole thing. It's open source. We're all part of the community. And that's what, it's the second thing that I would encourage all of you, the mindset to take, is that if you try all this stuff out and you think that it's beneficial, it doesn't necessarily exist in some of the bigger frameworks now, but if it's something that you think will help, then you voice your support and then things change. Like you can enable change. That's, I guess, the inspiring message I want to give to all of you. So thank you very much. I appreciate you coming to hear my talk. And yeah, I would love to answer any questions afterwards from you. Thanks. Can we do a Q&A?
Yeah, we got 15 minutes left. So.
Okay, yeah. So any questions, guys, or thoughts? Anybody? Does anybody have a public website or anything that uses search ranking? Some nodding heads there. All right.
I have a question. So there is no client-side, state.
Yeah.
If you use your state.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it doesn't have to be HTML per se that you're querying the DOM. Like you can also just put a JavaScript object in, a serialized object in the server view as well that you kind of deserialize or whatever.
And your hooks would know about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like you have to set it up. So it's all about your own way that things communicate. But yes, they would theoretically know how to communicate with each other, how to pick up from where the server left off. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, definitely track me down if you guys have questions later or thoughts, and I'll make all the stuff live. I also have a GitHub repo with the code they went over that I'll publish as well, so you can check it out. Cool. Thanks, everyone.